In the elevator, a woman pressed a card into my hand that said, "Get off at the next floor. He's following you." The card was a business card, cream-colored with nothing printed on it. Someone had written on the blank back in blue ink, in handwriting so controlled it looked almost typed. I read it twice in the 2 seconds between floors, because the elevator was moving and my brain needed the repetition to confirm that the words were real, and not some artifact of the exhaustion I'd been carrying for 3 weeks. The woman who'd pressed it into my palm was already looking at the elevator doors, her posture arranged into casual disinterest in the deliberate way of a person performing calm. She was 50-ish, business attire, or the kind of woman who could stand in an elevator and be invisible because nothing about her invited a second look, and I understood instantly that this was intentional, that the invisibility was the point. The elevator stopped at the 14th floor. She stepped off without looking back. I followed her. Because the card had told me to, and because there was a man behind me in the elevator who I had been telling myself for 3 weeks was a coincidence, and the card in my hand was telling me I had been wrong. The doors closed behind us. The corridor was empty. I turned to the woman and she was already walking efficiently toward the end of the hall, and she said without slowing down and without turning, "Keep walking. Don't look back at the elevator." I kept walking. My carry-on bag rolled behind me on the carpet, and the wheels made a sound that seemed much louder than it was. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me, because every other part of me was not. I had been traveling for work for 11 years. My name is Rena Okafor, I'm 38 years old, and I'm a senior compliance auditor for a financial services firm based in Chicago, which means I spend approximately 40% of my working life in airports and hotels and conference rooms in cities that are not my home, auditing the practices of client firms against regulatory standards and writing reports that occasionally get people fired and occasionally get firms fined and occasionally produce no consequence whatsoever except a very detailed document that everyone files and no one reads. It is important, painstaking, often dull work, and I'm good at it in the particular way of a person who was built for patience and precision and has made her peace with the fact that neither of those qualities makes for good dinner party conversation. I lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Square. I had a cat named Ptolemy and a subscription to 3 different streaming services and a standing Sunday call with my mother in Lagos, and a life that was full in the ways that mattered to me, even when other people looked at it and found it quiet. I had not been in a relationship for 2 years, which had been a deliberate choice following the end of something that had cost me more than I'd publicly admitted, and I had arrived at the kind of self-knowledge that comes from choosing solitude long enough to understand what you actually need from it. I mention all of this because the story of what happened to me over the 3 weeks before that elevator required knowing the kind of person I was: methodical, observant, not prone to drama, not likely to invent a threat that wasn't there. I had not invented this threat. It had found me anyway. It had started in Atlanta on a Monday in September at the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. I was in the Delta Sky Club waiting for a connection to Charlotte, laptop open, working through preliminary findings from an audit I'd been running for 6 weeks, when I noticed a man at the charging station across the room looking at me. Not the cursory glance of someone surveying available seats. Something more sustained, more deliberate, with the quality of attention that has a destination. I looked back briefly, in the way you register and dismiss. He looked away. I went back to my work. I told myself it was nothing. That was the first loop. The second loop began 4 days later in Charlotte at the hotel gym, 6:15 a.m., when the same man, I was almost certain it was the same man, the same height, same build, same quality of careful stillness, was on a treadmill at the far end of the row, and his eyes moved to the mirror at the exact moment I came in. Almost certain. Not certain. I did a 30-minute workout and left, and spent the ride up to my room arguing with myself about whether almost certain was enough to act on. It wasn't. I needed to be sure. The third loop was the one that stopped feeling like coincidence. I was on a flight to Minneapolis 10 days after Atlanta, window seat, headphones in, reviewing a document on my laptop, when I felt the particular awareness that comes from proximity, the sense that someone nearby is paying you a kind of attention that has weight to it. I looked up. He was in an aisle seat 3 rows back, looking directly at me. Not at his phone, not at the seat pocket, but not at the flight attendant moving down the aisle. At me. I held eye contact for 3 seconds and he did not look away. That was the moment I knew I was not inventing anything, but I still didn't know enough, and not knowing enough is worse than knowing nothing at all. His name, I would learn it eventually through means I will describe, was Craig Devereaux. I did not know that yet in the elevator, or in the 14th-floor corridor of the Minneapolis Hilton, where the woman who'd handed me the card was walking ahead of me with the efficiency of someone running a well-organized plan. She pushed open a door at the end of the corridor, a fire exit that led to a stairwell, held it for me and let it close behind us. The stairwell smelled like concrete and the particular dry cold of spaces that exist only for emergencies. She turned to face me for the first time, and her expression was the expression of a person who does a difficult thing professionally and without drama. "How long has he been following you?" she asked. I told her 3 weeks, maybe longer, and that I wasn't completely sure. She nodded like I'd confirmed something. "We've had him on radar for 8 months. You're the 4th person we know of." I asked who she was. She produced a card of her own, a real one this time, with printing on it. "Special Agent Carolyn Reyes," she said. And I want to pause here to note that her name is not on my forbidden list. It is simply her name, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office, Crimes Against Persons Unit. She had 17 years with the Bureau and the specific compacted authority of someone who had been underestimated enough times to stop being surprised by it and had simply learned to use it. "We've been working this case since March," she said. "We need your help." I stood in the stairwell with my carry-on bag and processed the fact that a federal agent had been in the same elevator as me, and a man the FBI had been watching for 8 months, which meant she had been there deliberately, which meant someone had been tracking him tracking me, which meant I had been inside a surveillance operation without knowing it. The feeling that produced was complex and not entirely comfortable. And Agent Reyes read it on my face with the practiced accuracy of someone whose job requires reading faces. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You're wondering why we didn't warn you sooner." I told her that was not quite what I was thinking. What I was thinking was how many of the past 3 weeks had been real chance encounters and how many had been staged. How much of what I thought was happening to me was actually happening around me, using me as a variable without my knowledge or consent. She accepted this without defensiveness, which I respected. "We needed him to stay comfortable," she said. "If he knew we were watching, we'd lose him and he'd start over with someone else." "I'm sorry. That's the honest answer." It was. I appreciated it and resented it in equal measure. Then I asked the question I actually needed answered. What had he done to the other 3 people? The answer came in a conference room on the 16th floor of the Minneapolis FBI field office, which was not in the Hilton but was 12 minutes away by car, a building with a lobby that looked like any other federal building. Security desk, badge scanners, the specific institutional light of places where consequential things happen without fanfare. Agent Reyes had called ahead from the stairwell. By the time we arrived, there were 2 other people waiting. The first was Special Agent Dominic Farr, 34, Reyes' partner on the case, with the contained energy of someone who had been working toward this moment for a long time and was managing the tension of proximity. The second was a woman I had not expected, Dr. Lieselotte Brammer, 51 years old, forensic psychologist, University of Minnesota, who consulted for the FBI on cases involving stalking and predatory behavioral patterns. So she had authored a textbook I had not read but recognized the title of, and she had the careful, receptive quality of a person who listened to things more than she said them. They gave me coffee. They showed me a photograph. Craig Devereaux was 46 years old, originally from Louisville, currently employed as a regional sales manager for a logistics company that operated across 17 states, which explained the travel pattern and the airport appearances in the cities that overlapped with mine. He was not someone you would look at twice in a crowd. Medium height, medium build, forgettable features, the kind of presentation that registers and releases without sticking. He had no criminal record. He was divorced, no children. He owned a townhouse in Cincinnati. He had been, for at least 8 months and possibly longer, systematically tracking professional women who traveled frequently for work, and what he did at the end of the tracking, the thing that had happened to the 3 women before me, had left none of them willing to go on record, which was why the FBI had been watching rather than arresting. They needed evidence they could take into a courtroom without depending on testimony from people too frightened to give it. So the 3 women were described to me by Agent Reyes in general terms because their identities were protected, and I understood and respected that even as I absorbed what had happened to them. The first had had her hotel room accessed. She'd returned to find things moved, not stolen, moved, rearranged in ways that communicated presence and access without leaving anything she could report as theft. The second had had her laptop remotely accessed while she slept. She discovered it when her own files began appearing on a burner email address she didn't recognize, forwarded with no message as if the forwarding itself were the message. The third had had photographs taken of her through a hotel room window and had received them anonymously through her work email account. Photographs that said, "I can see you, I can reach you, I have been this close, and no one stopped me." None of these things were, in the strict legal sense, enough. There was always deniability. There was always the gap between what had clearly been done and what could be proven, and Craig Devereaux understood that gap and operated inside it with the precision of someone who had studied its edges. Dr. Brammer explained this to me in the conference room with the clinical clarity of her discipline. "He's highly intelligent and highly organized," she said. "The escalation pattern across all 4 subjects suggests he's building towards something more direct. So the voyeurism and the intrusion and the communication, those are preludes. The next stage is contact." She paused. "He hasn't made direct contact with any of you yet." I thought about the treadmill at 6:15 a.m. and the sustained eye contact on the flight to Minneapolis. "He hasn't made contact," I said, "but he's been letting me see him, letting me know he's there." Dr. Brammer looked at Agent Reyes. "That's consistent with late-stage pre-contact behavior," she said. "He's testing her response. He wants to know how she reacts before he approaches." I thought about how I had reacted. Methodical, watchful, telling myself to be sure before I acted, never calling the police, never changing my hotels, never running. I had given him nothing to read. He had stayed on the edges, watching me not react, and had apparently decided I was ready for the next step, whatever that step was. What they needed from me was to become a documented witness rather than a passive subject. They needed me to interact with my normal travel schedule in a normal way, with a wire, with GPS tracking enabled on my phone and laptop, with a protocol in place for what to do if Devereaux made direct contact. They needed me to become the evidence they couldn't build without a willing participant. Agent Reyes was clear about what she was asking, and equally clear that I had every right to say no. If I said no, they would continue surveillance and attempt to build the case through other means. But the honest assessment was that without a living witness willing to be present and documented for the next stage of his behavior, the case could take another year, and in another year the next person he identified might not be as observant or as composed or as fortunate as I had been to encounter an FBI agent in the right elevator at the right time. I asked for 24 hours to think about it. They gave me the night. I sat in a different hotel room than the one Devereaux knew about. Agent Farr had arranged an alternate booking under a different name, 2 floors above the room that was still registered in my name, where Devereaux would presumably believe I was sleeping. And I called my brother Emeka in Chicago, who was the person I called when I needed to think through something that mattered. Emeka was a 40-year-old emergency medicine physician who had a gift for risk assessment that came from spending years making decisions about human life under time pressure. I told him everything. He listened. He asked 3 questions. What were the risks if I cooperated? What were the risks if I didn't? And what would I regret more? I answered all 3 honestly. We stayed on the phone for another hour and a half, not talking about the decision, but about other things. Our mother's upcoming birthday, a book we'd both been reading, the noise his upstairs neighbor made at midnight. And by the time I hung up, I knew what I was going to do. I went to sleep and slept 6 hours without interruption, which is either evidence of courage or pathological compartmentalization, and I have never fully determined which. I told Agent Reyes yes at 8 a.m. the next morning. The operation that followed was organized with the precision of a plan that had been partially built before my agreement and needed only to be completed now that I was inside it. There was a technical briefing conducted by an FBI communications specialist named Kwame Asante, 38 years old, 12 years with the Bureau's Electronic Surveillance Division, who spent 45 minutes explaining the equipment I'd be carrying: a modified Samsung phone with enhanced recording capability, a small device sewn into the lining of my work bag that functioned as a secondary audio and location transmitter, and a protocol code I would use in text to Agent Reyes if I needed immediate extraction. Kwame was precise and patient, and checked 3 times that I understood each element before moving to the next, which I found enormously reassuring in the way that competence always is when the stakes are real. There was a legal briefing conducted by Assistant U.S. Attorney Priya Nair, 42 years old with the Chicago U.S. Attorney's Office, who had been assigned to the case in the spring, and who explained to me, in the careful language of someone who had done this many times, what constituted admissible evidence under federal stalking statutes and what my role as a cooperating witness would mean for the prosecution if it got that far. She was direct about the uncertainties. Nothing was guaranteed, cases collapsed, or witnesses got exhausted and withdrew. And she was equally direct about what she believed they had and what they needed. If he makes contact and you document it, she said, we have him. What he's done to the other 3 women becomes pattern evidence for sentencing. The case goes from difficult to straightforward. She paused. I know that's not a small ask. It wasn't. I thanked her for being honest about it. The next 4 days were the most concentrated exercise and sustained performance I have ever undertaken. I returned to my normal schedule, the hotel room in my name on the 12th floor of the Minneapolis Hilton, meals in the hotel restaurant, work in the conference room where my audit meeting was held. The morning run I did every day at 6:40 a.m., regardless of city. Agent Farr had a room on the same floor, and Agent Reyes was in a vehicle outside at all times, or had a relief agent in her place. I knew this. I had to behave as though I didn't. I had to go about the business of being Rena Okafor, compliance auditor, professional traveler, woman alone in a hotel, without the 20% additional tension in my shoulders that might signal to someone observant that something had changed. This was harder than it sounds. What made it manageable was the work itself, which was real and demanding and occupied enough of my mind that the performance became, in stretches, something close to genuine. On the second day, I saw Devereaux in the hotel lobby at 11:15 a.m. He was in a chair near the elevator bank with a newspaper, an actual print newspaper, which struck me as a deliberate prop. And he looked up when I crossed the lobby toward the restaurant and held my gaze for 5 seconds before looking back at his paper. The wire was transmitting. The phone in my bag was recording. I walked into the restaurant and ordered a salad I didn't eat and read through my audit notes and breathed through my nose with deliberate steadiness. On the 3rd day, nothing. His room was still registered. Agent Farr confirmed this through hotel management, who had been cooperating fully since a conversation between Agent Reyes and the hotel's security director on day 1, but he made no visible appearances. Dr. Brammer, when Reyes relayed this to her, said the withdrawal was consistent with the testing pattern. He was watching my reaction to his visibility. He wanted to see if the lack of appearance produced anxiety or relief. He wanted to understand how I was reading the situation. The contact came on the 4th day at 7:18 p.m. in the hotel bar. I was sitting at the far end with a glass of Syrah and my laptop, which was the thing I did when I had work that needed doing and wanted a change of environment from the room. A routine I'd maintained across all 4 days because routine was the signal. Routine said nothing has changed, and I'm not afraid. He sat down 2 stools away without asking, which is the kind of presumptuousness that announces itself. He ordered a scotch and looked at his own phone for 90 seconds, and then he said without looking at me, "Long week?" His voice was even and pleasant and contained nothing alarming on the surface, which was the point. The surface was always fine. What lived underneath the surface was the 8 months of documented surveillance and the 3 women whose privacy had been violated in ways they were still carrying. I looked up from my laptop with the measured attention of someone who has been interrupted and is deciding whether to engage. "Long month," I said, which was true. He smiled. He introduced himself as Craig. He asked what I did for work. We had a conversation that lasted 41 minutes, which I know because the recording logged timestamps, and it was the most uncomfortable performance of my life, because I had to be present and respond authentically and not show any of the knowledge I was sitting with, not let any of the clinical assessment Dr. Brammer had given me, late-stage pre-contact behavior, be escalating toward direct interaction, show in my face or my body or the pace of my answers. He was objectively easy to talk to. That was the disturbing part. He asked questions with the interest of someone genuinely curious, and the questions were appropriate and the conversation was unremarkable, and if I hadn't known what I knew, I might have found the encounter pleasant. I excused myself at 8:59 p.m., citing an early meeting, and took the elevator to my floor. I then sat on the bathroom floor with my back against the tub for approximately 4 minutes before I texted Agent Reyes the code phrase we'd agreed on, which was, "Book confirmed for tomorrow." Her reply came in 40 seconds. "Good. Get some sleep. The text he sent my work phone at 11:40 p.m. was the evidence Priya Nair had described as the difference between difficult and straightforward. I don't know how he got my work number. The case eventually established that he'd accessed it through a professional networking database breach that was, itself, a federal matter. The text said, "It was good to meet you tonight. I've been looking forward to it." The phrase "I've been looking forward to," it did a specific thing to the temperature of the room, because it was not the phrase of someone who had met me for the first time. It was the phrase of someone who had been waiting. Agent Reyes had my phone mirrored. She saw it when I saw it. She called me 30 seconds later. "That's it," she said. "That's the contact. We move tomorrow morning." I asked what moving meant. She described it in the efficient language of someone running through a plan they had prepared. Devereaux would be approached in his hotel room at 8 a.m. by Agents Reyes and Farr with a federal warrant for his arrest on charges of interstate stalking under 18 U.S.C. Section 2261A, which covered his pattern of conduct across multiple states, targeting multiple individuals. The warrant had been prepared and was pending the contact evidence that the text had now provided. I asked if I needed to be present. She said I did not need to be present, but that she would call me when it was done. I thanked her. I did not sleep. The call came at 8:43 a.m. I was sitting at the desk in my room with cold coffee and a document I had been reading the same paragraph of for 20 minutes. "He's in custody," Reyes said. Her voice was the voice of someone at the end of a long effort who is allowing themselves exactly one moment of satisfaction before the paperwork begins. I exhaled through my mouth in a long, slow release. "All right," I said, which was not an adequate response to the information, but was the only one I had available. But she told me what came next: a federal grand jury process, my testimony as a cooperating witness, the evidence from the other 3 women being incorporated as pattern conduct under the sentencing guidelines, a process that would take months and would require my sustained engagement. She told me I would have Priya Nair's office as a resource throughout, and that there was a victim advocate assigned to my case whose name was Bettina Sousa, and that I should call Bettina the moment anything felt like too much. I wrote down Bettina Sousa's number on the hotel notepad. Then I sat at the desk for a long time looking at the Minneapolis skyline through the window, at the particular flat light of a northern city in October, and let myself feel what I hadn't let myself feel for 4 days, which was the specific trembling aftermath of sustained danger, the body's invoice for everything the mind had suppressed in order to function. Oh, it wasn't dramatic. It was just fatigue and something that sat behind the eyes like pressure and the cold reality of what the past 3 weeks had actually been. I let it be what it was. Then I closed my laptop, packed my bag, and called Amika. The grand jury indictment came 6 weeks after the arrest. Craig Devereaux was charged with 5 counts of interstate stalking. The 3 prior victims had both agreed, after learning of the arrest and the cooperating witness evidence, to provide statements through their attorneys, which supplemented the direct evidence from my documented contact. Priya Nair called me when the indictment was handed down and used a word I remembered: clean. "The evidence is clean," she said. "The recording, the text, your testimony, the pattern documentation. There's nothing here for a defense to work with." The trial was set for 8 months out, and Devereaux's attorney, a capable criminal defense lawyer in Minneapolis named Gregor Vance, attempted 3 pretrial motions to suppress evidence that were all denied by the presiding judge. I know this because Priya emailed me after each ruling with a brief summary and the phrase "still on track," which I appreciated more than I could adequately express. I gave my testimony in a federal courtroom in Minneapolis on a Thursday in June, 11 months after the elevator. I had prepared for it for months, working with Bettina Sousa and with a therapist I'd begun seeing in November, Dr. Amara Osei, 45 years old, Chicago-based, specializing in trauma and recovery, who had been recommended by Bettina and who had the particular combination of warmth and structure that makes the hardest conversations feel survivable. I was on the stand for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Gregor Vance cross-examined me for 85 minutes, and the cross-examination was thorough and professional and produced nothing useful for the defense because the facts were what they were, and I knew them with the precision of a person who had been trained in documentation and had documented everything. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 5 counts. Craig Devereaux was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, with 3 years of supervised release following, and a lifetime prohibition on contact with all 5 named victims. The sentence was not, in the strict terms of what had been done and what it had cost the women involved, enough. It was what the law provided, and Priya Nair had been honest with me from the beginning about the gap between legal outcome and moral accounting. I sat with that gap for a while. I still sit with it sometimes. I have found that sitting with it is more useful than trying to close it. I thought about Agent Carolyn Reyes often in the months that followed. I thought about the calculation she had made in the elevator, the decision to hand me that card, to break protocol, to bring me inside the operation rather than continue using me as an unknowing variable. She had told me in a conversation after the verdict that she had been watching me watching him for 2 weeks and had decided I was the kind of person who would rather know than not know, regardless of the difficulty of knowing. I asked her how she'd made that assessment. She said she'd watched me on the 3rd loop, the flight from Charlotte to Minneapolis, when I'd held eye contact with him for 3 seconds and he hadn't looked away and I hadn't either, and I'd turned back to my document and kept working. "Someone who panics, looks away," she said. "Someone who runs, changes seats. You just went back to your document? That tells me something about how you process threat. You needed information, not comfort." She was right. She had been right from the elevator. The elevator itself felt, in retrospect, like the pivot point of a story that had a different ending waiting for it if she'd stayed in her seat and let the doors close. She had not stayed in her seat. She had pressed a card into my hand and stepped out and trusted that I would follow, and I had, and the rest of the story had unspooled from that moment. So I thought about the other possibility often in the months after the trial. The version of events without the card, without the stairwell, without the name Carolyn Reyes and the cream-colored card, with blue handwriting telling me to get off at the next floor. I thought about what the next stage would have looked like, the one Dr. Brammer had described as contact, and I found that I couldn't hold the thought for long because it produced a cold in my chest that I didn't have language for. I had language for the version that actually happened. That was enough. Dr. Osei and I worked together for 14 months. The work we did was not dramatic in the way that people expect therapy to be dramatic. It was slow and specific and often felt like maintenance rather than repair, the way you calibrate an instrument rather than fix a broken one. What I took from it in the end was a more honest relationship with my own observational habits. The ways I had been trained by experience to notice things and trust myself, and also to doubt that trusting, to require certainty before acting, and how that requirement of certainty had kept me inside a dangerous situation for 3 weeks longer than necessary. I had not been wrong to be precise. I had been wrong to conflate precision with paralysis. That is a distinction I carry with me now in the specific embodied way of something that cost you to learn. I still travel extensively for work. I still stay in the hotels and eat in the restaurants and work in the conference rooms of cities that are not mine. I am not afraid of elevators. What I am is present in them in a way I wasn't before, the kind of present that notices the other people sharing the space, the weight and quality of their attention, the way a stranger's posture changes when they decide to press something into your hand. I think about Carolyn Reyes every time. I think about what it takes to act on what you know when acting is inconvenient, risky, contrary to protocol, against the grain of the system you operate inside. She told me the honest thing. We needed him comfortable. We let you stay in it. I'm sorry. And she'd handed me the card anyway. She had decided that the honest thing and the right thing were both true simultaneously, and had acted on both. I have tried to operate by that principle every day since. In this work, in this life, in the elevators of whatever city I find myself in next. You notice? You act. You do not wait to be certain. The certain moment never comes.